Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where I'll be talking about feedback techniques. Now before I start talking about feedback techniques, I'd recommend watching my video on formative assessment because this one kind of feeds from formative assessment, and I'll go through and explain why that's the case in a short while. Now, feedback techniques are really important because it's an essential part of the teaching and learning process. And I don't think you have to be Einstein to see how important feedback is in that process when we draw it quite simply on the board. So for example, let's say you've got a teacher asks a question, student provides a response, and the teacher then provides feedback, or some type of response in response to the student's answer or response that they gave to that initial question or that initial request. So that's just the very, I won't rub that off yet, very simple way of explaining, at least initially, where feedback comes from and why it is used. Because you can imagine if that didn't happen, that bit there, and this may seem obvious when I'm drawing it on the board like this, but I've been in many classes before where I see teachers or teacher aides not actually taking that next step there. It happens all the time. So it's very important to remember that if you are engaged in some type of communication with a student, whatever that is, or seeking information from them, then there is that three-step process where you're initiating contact or requiring them to do something or demonstrating something or observing them or whatever. The student is then going through and completing an activity of sorts. And then there's also that follow-up afterwards. Now, in here, this is where at this point here, this is where the formative assessment happens. Formative assessment happens, and that then informs the type of feedback, and not only the type of feedback, but the feedback that is provided to that student. So that is where it leads to a logical, I guess, way of providing feedback based on how the student went in the response that they provided, if that makes sense. So that formative assessment, by the way, is based on the goals of the lesson or where you think that student should be at in regards to that particular activity or topic or level of difficulty or whatnot that they're working at. So you're making a judgment call there, and then you're providing some type of feedback. So now, as far as feedback is concerned, there are a range of different reasons for why we provide feedback. And I think that's probably something worth just jotting down. And it's not necessarily the case that we only provide feedback verbally or that we only provide it in assessments and things like that. There's a range of different reasons for why teachers, teacher aides, trainers and other professionals provide feedback. And it's important to realize that and think about that, even though it seems to be obvious, because each of these different, let's call them opportunities to provide feedback, are also opportunities for us to improve students' motivation and skills and so on and so forth. So obviously we provide feedback verbally during the day. So let's just go day to day. So on the day to day, we're constantly doing formative assessment to figure out if the student is progressing as we expect them to, or they're going okay or whatnot, if they have problems, and we're constantly providing feedback to them. So that's an ongoing thing that happens during the lesson. At the end of an activity or a lesson, there is some type of summary feedback. So usually that's either on a whole of class basis or on an individual or group basis. I'm going to call that summative feedback. Now, there is also some formal feedback. And actually, I'm going to not use that word summative because that'll confuse people, because have a video on summative assessment, and that's not what I mean by that one. So we're going to call that end of activity feedback. So end of activity feedback. And then you've got formal feedback. Now that is for your summative assessment, your summative assessments or your diagnostic assessments. And bear in mind, if you have watched that video on formative assessment, then you know that most, not all, but most diagnostic assessments are actually a formative type of assessment because it's used to inform a feedback in an adjustment type process to help students then go on and reach their goals. Whereas summative assessment doesn't do that. Pure summative assessment, proper summative assessment is about saying, you've learnt all this stuff here, let's assess it so that we can give you a grade. So anyway, that's by the by. So you've got verbally, so that's just a chat as you sort of go, providing that feedback. End of the session, end of the day, end of the activity type feedback. You've got formal feedback to students. You've also got feedback to parents. Yeah, I'll just write parents here. Parents. So that's usually some type of communication diary. It can be student-parent interviews or teacher-parent interviews and teacher-parent nights and things like that. Quite often teachers will call parents on a regular basis just to say hi and keep in contact. It's a really good way to assist with managing behaviour and things like that as well. So regular contact with parents is another way of providing feedback, not only to the student because they're usually reading or getting that information somehow or through parents and whatnot, but also to actual parents themselves because they can contribute, say, to helping to improve reading and things like that. So my personal opinion is a lot of parents, even in high schools, would like to help and contribute to their child's education, but they're just not given those opportunities. And a lot of teachers, teacher aides are quite scared of parents and prefer not to contact them because there is always one or two out of every 10 or 20 or whatever who can be quite difficult. So for that reason, a lot of teachers just don't contact parents unless they actually have to. But I've written a section about that in my behaviour book, and I'll also do a video about that sometime in the future because yes, you're going to have a few difficult parents who are not, well, let's just say you're going to have a few difficult parents who don't see the value in education, depending on where you're working. But generally speaking, 95% of parents, caregivers, whoever the student lives with are going to be very open to working with you, and it does create a little bit of work, but it can be you can get a lot of benefit from that because learning time during class is very limited, as you may have seen from the maths when we work out how much actual learning time you've got, taking into account administration issues and absences and being late and interruptions and mucking around at the start of the lesson, at the end of the lesson, and transitions and so on and so forth. So they're probably the four main ways and reasons in which feedback is provided. It's not just on a as we go sort of day-to-day lesson. As I went through before, student asks a question or teacher asks a question and then there's a response and then there's feedback provided. That is important, but there are lots of other ways in which we provide feedback and they are all important. So as a professional educator, whether you're a teacher aide, paraprofessional, SSO, or a teacher or a principal or whatever, it's important to think of every aspect of your job in a systematic fashion and to be able to think through the various different steps of each of those jobs in almost like a scientific way and to make sure that you're using best practice for each of those different ways. Now, normally I would start this webinar when I talk about different types of feedback techniques. Obviously the verbal one is an area that we concentrate on quite a bit. The one at the end, I've done some videos on reviews and consolidations because as you know, if you've seen my explicit teaching if you have seen my explicit teaching webinars or read about them, then you will know that under that explicit teaching model, so let's just call that ET, you'll start off the lesson here and there'll be a review of some type, right? So you're reviewing, consolidating knowledge from previous from previous lectures. and making that link between what students have learnt in previous sessions, but also making that link in what they know from previous years or from just their general watching TV and all that kind of stuff, general knowledge. Now there's also another review down here, and that's more of like a consolidation session, I prefer to call it, but you do various different reviews, and during that process, then so you're linking that to that, and then you're also linking all the different, say there's 4 aspects there. You're linking that to there, to there, to there, to there. That's important to follow some type of structure. Even if you're doing play-based learning or constructivist type learning, it is important to have those goals set there to review what you know, to bridge that gap and to show that we actually already know 30 or 40% of this particular topic or whatnot. Now we're just going to build on that existing knowledge, and then down the bottom we're joining up our goals with our progress throughout, as has been gleaned from the formative assessment and the feedback that we received verbally. Now this end of activity feedback, as we'll call it, normally a consolidation as well. Consolidation is all about achievement against that goal, achievement against the things in here, and to really give students an idea about what you're going to do next lesson. If you're working with students that have neurological disabilities and neurological disorders, particularly autism, then you're definitely going to be using some stringent structures there, because putting structures in place, particularly when working with students with disabilities, is super important. But I like to use a heavily structured, explicit instruction type model anyway, regardless of whether it's just a general class or you're working with one-on-one students or adults or year 3s. It doesn't really matter. For me, I normally always use that sort of model, but that's just my, my preference. It's not necessarily what you have to do. And even if I move away from that and I am doing more play-based stuff or constructivist type stuff, then I'll still use many different elements regardless from that explicit instruction model, which includes those reviews at different parts. Now, a review naturally includes a ton of feedback, particularly this one here, because you're looking at what they've done, what they've achieved, what they're going to be doing next lesson and linking to that, but also what they've done against those various different goals. So as a class, you'll provide feedback, so how they went. As an individual, you'll provide feedback, not necessarily to every single student, every lesson, because that's just not logistically possible, and for groups of students as well. Personally, I like to always try and stand around the door or somewhere like that as students are entering and exiting, and then you're constantly able to give feedback to every 4th student or something like that, not ignoring those middle grounders or the high achievers. So you're not always just focusing on the ones that are causing behavioural problems or who are low achieving but have tried really hard and things like that. While that is important, I always remind people to, now I think ethically and morally, I think that we should equally divide our time amongst all students. So anyway, that's that's how your lesson plan and the activities there relate to that end of activity feedback. Obviously the top one, that day-to-day one, is where you're giving feedback at various different times. That's a stupid way to do it. So you might do it here, you might do it there, 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 you might do it there. So you're constantly providing feedback to students. As you circulate around the room, you're giving them little bits of information, and we'll go through what best practice looks like as far as providing that feedback. But point is, I wanted to just be very clear that feedback is something that you will constantly be doing. You're doing it at the start of lessons, at the end of lessons, you're doing it throughout lessons, you're doing it formally, you're doing it by contacting home, you're doing it at the end of tests and exams, and so on and so forth. So it's not something that you're just providing feedback now and then. It's the same as formative assessment, where I teach formative assessment, and then I always try and drill home the fact that it's a constant thing. It's like rapport building as well. These are constant things that really high-performing teachers, teacher aides, trainers are doing non-stop, almost non-stop. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to rub all that off for the moment, because I'm going to need a ton of room here, and I think we can rub this off as well. And we'll swap pens, shall we? Okay, so there are a range of different reasons corrections, improve knowledge, and that is behaviour management and academic. So there are a range of different reasons for why we provide feedback. For why we provide feedback to students, because it's not always just academic. Sometimes there are other reasons why we want to provide feedback. So I'm just writing them up here as they come to mind. Metacognitive skills is another one. And we've got transferable skills and coping skills, and so on. So the first one is for pure corrections. So you're correcting a student either from a behaviour management perspective. So there are things called pre-corrections, corrections, and error correction. There's a few different types there that I've got some other videos on. So watch those behaviour management videos. I'm not going to concentrate too much on that because obviously you are providing constant feedback to students as far as their behaviour is concerned. But in this video, I'm mainly talking about feedback in an academic sense. In an academic sense. So we're talking about developing their skills and knowledge, specifically in, say, reading, writing, science, that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're providing corrections to students. That's one type of feedback. Another type of feedback, or another reason for providing feedback, is to improve their knowledge. And obviously, because there are lots of different ways in which you can provide feedback and lots of different reasons for that feedback, it's important to consider why you are providing it. Because, for example, if you walk around and you're just sitting with a group of 2 or 3 students and you're just constantly correcting their work, you've got to think, okay, are they going to be improving? So this is what new teachers do, beginning teachers, graduate teachers, and those parent helpers and people who are sort of untrained teacher aides and things like that. They will use just a lot of basic corrections and sort of ignore the rest. Maybe do a little bit of knowledge, but not ignore the rest, but they've never been trained in using all these other things that are really, really important. And probably more important, in fact. Sorry, I'm just writing these down as they come to me, because there's quite a few of them. It's sort of a never-ending list, really. Okay, so corrections is the basic one, and yes, you can provide corrections, but it's not that overly important in the whole scheme of things. Sometimes if a student gets a question wrong, you correct them, they'll go on to the next question, they'll completely have forgotten about that anyway, because importantly, the most important thing we want to concentrate on is more so those metacognitive skills or process skills. I just use the broad term metacognitive skills, but please watch my video on metacognitive skills, and I am aware that there is a difference between metacognitive skills, cognitive skills, executive functioning skills, and just general general study skills, but I just call them all metacognitive skills. I don't care if that's technically incorrect. So, for example, processes and procedures. So you're teaching kids the concepts behind what's going on and the processes for what's happening. So if you're just correcting them and giving them an answer to something, like how to spell a word, I wouldn't say that's a waste of time, but it's probably almost a complete waste of your time. What you're really trying to get them to do is to understand the concepts and processes behind those things. So spelling patterns, for example, or mathematical or maths steps to working out a particular problem and the reason for why we follow those steps. Because if students understand the reasons for why we follow those steps, then they don't need to memorize things. They don't have that surface knowledge. They're not just memorizing the steps. They understand the logical sequence for going through and doing it. So so watch my video on the metacognitive skills. While it is important to increase students' knowledge and to provide corrections to them, I like to spend more time on metacognitive skills because those skills are also transferable. And by transferable skills, I've done another video on that, so please watch that. But transferable skills typically mean the type of generic skills that students can take with them to other classes. So as opposed to metacognitive skills, which is thinking about thinking, planning, processes, chunking things down, so on, transferable skills is more about those generic sort of actual skills that they can do that you can list on your resume type of thing. So that's being able to type quickly, fix a computer, being able to, fix certain things, being a problem solver, so on and so forth. So watch my video on transferable skills. And the other one is coping skills, which I've also got a video about. And coping skills is basically all about resilience and dealing with failure. That's what coping is really about, dealing with stress, dealing with anxiety, and usually in many cases, in the classroom environment anyway, that comes from either failure or fear of failure. So that's what coping skills is all about. Now, if you can embed that into the way in which you provide feedback to students, then I think you're doing a fantastic job, because those types of skills aren't really taught that often to kids. You hear these key words all the time, like resilience and self-esteem and all this kind of stuff, but very few people know how to teach it. Very few people do teach it, and it's almost like it's just a buzzword that everyone talks about. But if you ask any given teacher, or most teachers, how are you teaching self-esteem, or how are you in teaching resilience, they won't be able to give you an answer in 10 words or less. So I think it's important to also bear in mind that when you are providing feedback, let's just do some basic maths. 60 minutes for a lesson. Let's say you've got 60 minutes for a lesson. 10 minutes of that is at the start and end, so there's no feedback there. That leaves you with 50 minutes to provide feedback to students while doing a bunch of other activities as well, right? Now let's just make this simple and say you've got 25 kids in a class. So I can work this out easy. That gives you 2 minutes per student. Right. So you have 2 minutes per student in one lesson, say a maths lesson. And if you're in a middle school or whatever, you might only see that student twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever it is, depending on the school and their structures and stuff. You have 2 minutes to come and talk to this particular student, and you have these options. So this student is struggling with this, say, Venn diagrams, because that's the example I always use. So you've got 2 different categories, and then in the middle there, you've got some data points and then some overlapping data, right? Now, you've only got 2 minutes in a one-on-one type situation or a small group situation, let's assume. What is the most useful way, what can help that student in the, say, medium to long term in the most effective way? Is it saying we got question 1, 3 and 7 wrong? Is that really going to help them that much? I mean, maybe, but, or is concentrating on their metacognitive skills or their, let's actually write this one in, call it concept understanding, or concentrating on their concept understanding, or is that the most important thing? Because remember, one of the mistakes that novice educators do is to feel that they have to correct and edit and correct everything that's wrong. You don't have to correct everything that's wrong. You can ignore most of the things that students do that are wrong. You don't have to lie and tell them that it's correct, but you don't have to. If they do 10 maths questions, there is no reason why you need to go through and mark those 10 questions and give them a score, because long-term wise, does that help them, or how does that help them in any way? If it's a test or something, fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you've got a limited amount of time, correcting their work as your main form of feedback isn't really helping very much at all. Maybe you can give them a little bit of knowledge, but I would be more so concentrating in this area here, where you're trying to provide them with those metacognitive skills. Again, watch my video on that. That's quite a comprehensive video. Those generic transferable skills that they can take. I like to think of transferable skills as skills that they can take from job to job. So let's say they're working at a department store, and then after that they can go work at a grocery store. What type of generic skills can they take from job to job? So that's what transferable skills are. Coping skills, we went through that before. And that concept understanding, which is really probably the crux of what I'm trying to say here, is that concept understanding is the most important thing. So for this one here, correcting the students and saying, no, you got the answer wrong. It's not 3, cross that out. Actually, the answer's 4. See you later. Good luck with the next question. That's not going to help anyone. And again, unfortunately, we see that all the time. That's what novice educators do, people who are fresh out of university or their courses. So I always push this idea that the concept is important. So who cares about the answer? The answer at the end is not relevant. If the student gets the answer wrong, but they understand the concept, then fantastic. I mean, maybe you could then correct it, but in that sense, they understand the concept. So it's important to accurately diagnose that. And I did do another video on, I I did do another video, it's called 101 Instruction, where I went through this treatment loop and it showed how to diagnose accurately where students are having problems, because students generally don't have problems with, the example I always use is reading, they have problems with something within that skill. So they have problems with high utility words or grammar or whatever. And there are various different reasons for why students have issues. Sometimes it's a pure knowledge thing, sometimes it's an understanding thing, sometimes it's a process thing, sometimes it's a language thing. So that understanding is sort of like concept understanding I probably should have written. So sometimes they just don't understand the process. So I do this before I do this, before I do this, and so on and so forth. There's language reasons, and there's a couple of others, but that's in my 101 instruction video. So point is, you can't always make the assumption that the reason that they got that question wrong is because they just have a knowledge problem. It's like you wouldn't simplistically think, oh, they just don't know how to do it, because they might know how to do 5 or 6 aspects of it, but there's just one thing that they got wrong. Or it could actually be a language issue, or it could be a process issue. So a language issue, quite often you have worded questions. They may not understand the definition of something. Process issue is a very common one, as I've just said, because you'll have 5 different processes and students will be able to do all those. They just can't do that very end one, but they understand the concept. So the first thing to check is whether they understand the concept. That's really important. Before you start providing feedback, think about what type of feedback what type of feedback you're going to provide. Is it going to be basic? Is it going to be just a general factual or knowledge type feedback, or in some other way? Bearing in mind that you can ignore the fact that they got it wrong. And you might want to point that out, but then you could move on and start talking about other things, which will better help them achieve in that particular topic over, say, the next 2 or 3 weeks. So just bear that in mind. Now, I've ignored this one for a short period of time, but I'm going to start talking about it now. Motivation / self-esteem is particularly important, and there are critical literacy. Obviously, you've got parents. Ran out of room. Do another one here. Goals. Okay. So, motivation and self-esteem is another really important reason for why we provide feedback. If you're looking at a student who's done some reading, say a spelling, or not a reading, well, let's say they've written a small short story and it goes for, I don't know, a couple of 100 words, so it's just short of a page or whatever. If you go in and then the feedback that you provide is all negative and you just highlight all the spelling errors and all the grammatical errors, a student gets back this page that's full of all these red crosses and all the things that they've done wrong, then that's obviously potentially going to demotivate that student quite a lot. So in that sense, what you've actually done is provided a hell of a lot of negative feedback, when the general rule is that you should be providing somewhere about 4 to 1, and some even say it's about 6 to 1. So for every piece of negative feedback that you provide, so that's your negative feedback there and there, you're providing 4 pieces of positive feedback or 6 pieces of positive feedback to help them improve. And I can't remember which one it was, but that is actual research based. So that comes from academic research, peer-reviewed papers that have been published. So that's, I guess, not so much, well, it is a general rule, but it's also something that has been proven by educational researchers. So it's a very important concept to remember. It also applies in the behaviour management world as well, if you're using what is known as a strength-based approach or a trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care and strength-based approaches apply to are ways of dealing with students in certain ways that really does concentrate on what they're doing right as opposed to what they're doing wrong. So just bear that one in mind. Now, a couple of other ones that I've put on there is critical literacy. So I've done a little video on critical literacy if you're teaching high school especially, or really year 5 onwards. and particularly if you're teaching adults, regardless of the topic, critical literacy is really important. It's basically the ability to look at any type of text, whatever it is, and to be able to unpack it and deconstruct it and think about it, think about who wrote it, why they wrote certain things, why they put it in certain order. That might sound a little complicated, but watch that critical literacy video, because I do go through the various ways that you can approach doing that. And if you are working in education, then having something of a grounding in critical literacy, I personally think is quite important. Even if you're teaching something like maths or science or phys ed or whatever, your critical literacy skills are very, very important. Now, obviously you've got parents, which we spoke about before. If you are providing feedback, also bearing in mind that the feedback that you provide to a child, quite often you're writing in their homework journal or their, communication book that does go to parents. Now, while you're doing that, think about what type of feedback you want to provide to parents and how that can be useful. If you're just going through the motions and providing corrections to parents, how useful is that? Probably not so much. So I just put that as a little dash up there for you to really think about, and just bear this in mind as well. So when you are providing feedback to parents, it's not an excuse to whinge and complain and just vent your frustrations. You've got to do it in a way that is helps that student improve. And that's why I see the whole point of feedback is to help students improve, not just now, not just so that they can perform in this one task, which is usually a surface learning type achievement, I guess you could say, but how they can develop that deeper understanding and ability so that they are going to be able to perform better in the future, say next week or the week after or the next lesson. Okay, and goals. Goals are sort of related to everything that we're talking about here. You're providing feedback to student, as we drew on the board before, in relation to the goals that you've set, and that could be goals in their individual education plan, could be the goals that the teacher sets for that lesson, it could be the overall goal if you're learning how to, fly a plane, and at the end you want to sit a test, or you are going to sit a test, then during that process there will be certain milestones and goals, and it's important to provide that feedback and that update about where that student is at, and that closely relates to motivation as well. So I got some videos I got a video on goal setting or setting goals, whatever I called it, so just make sure you watch that, because that is a super important video and the super important content there that relates to feedback quite intimately. And just by the way, it's not just goals, it is goals, but micro goals. I like to talk about micro, let's call them mid-term and progress or milestone. I don't know if you can read that. It's hard to write it down there. With goals, you've also got this thing called micro goals. That's actually supposed to be an R. You've also got this thing called micro goals, which is like little goals. That's just the term that I guess I don't know if I stole that from somewhere or just picked it up and started using it. But micro means small, right? So what that basically means is that in a lesson, students are meeting lots of goals in a lesson. And not only are they meeting those goals in a lesson, but they're also meeting the little sub-goals that have been set at the start. So they might be you might want them to learn Venn diagrams, but as you're going through that process of them learning Venn diagrams from start to finish in a 1-hour lesson, they've kind of figured out the concept of being able to use different categories. So you've got dogs, cats, that wouldn't work, tall people, short people, and people that live in cities or something like that. As they grasp that concept and they figure out how to, because the first step of that would be to do them separately, and then the second step would be then to join them together, right? So as they figure that concept out and they'll be able to do that, then they've met a micro goal. So being able to provide that feedback so students know that of those different processes, we've now done 1, 2, and 3. We've only got 2 more to go. And if you watch those micro skills lessons, webinars, you'll understand or might remember that let's say you get to a point where the students are struggling, you can then divide that further into, say, 3 different sections. Then students may get that one, they may get that one, and then they may struggle with that. Because even the most simple tasks like Venn diagrams, you can easily divide into multiple steps, which is an important, from our perspective, that's called chunking, and it's an important way to scaffold that learning down for students. but also because then you can set goals, students can achieve micro goals, that improves their motivation, and when you teach that particular skill to students, that is a type of metacognitive skill, which they can then go on and apply elsewhere. So, okay, now, first one. Okay, so just quickly, there are 4, I guess you could call them little rules, 3 or 4, a couple of them are kind of similar, and I think in my book I only spoke about 3, but as I was writing that up, I was thinking there's probably more like 4 rules that you should bear in mind when you're providing feedback. First, obviously, it has to be simple. Watch my video on questioning techniques, because I go through that and spend quite a bit of time on how to phrase questions in the right way and why that's so important. Those same, I guess, rules and best practice apply to feedback techniques. So it should be simple. And what I mean by simple is, unlike me right now, rambling on for long periods of time is not best practice. So just be careful about the type of language and that you use there, which is why we want to keep it as clear as possible. So simple, short, sharp, single sentences, focused on the actual topic at hand and relevant to the topic at hand, and immediate. So the general best practice is that feedback should be provided as soon as possible after the event. And I have this vague recollection that there's some research about that, about the dissipating effect of feedback the longer you leave it after the event. So just bear that one in mind. There was another one that just popped in my head a second ago. Specific. Yeah, so feedback should also be specific. Now, what that means is that for example, if students are doing Venn diagrams, your feedback is related to Venn diagrams. So it's not a broad-based, you're doing fantastic, or well done, Johnny. You can do that, and that's also considered best practice it is considered best practice, and you can do that. But a lot of your feedback and what you'll read in a lot of textbooks and things like that state that feedback should also be, or maybe you could use a combination of, specific and more general feedback. But so specific feedback means that you're saying, how you did that Venn diagram? Perfect. Remember at the start of the lesson, you didn't know how to do it, and now you've absolutely aced it. Well done. So you've given feedback that is specific to that particular task. There's probably another one that you could add there that is in terms of behaviour management. As far as feedback and behaviour management goes, it's important to make sure that the feedback you provide to the student is about the behaviour and not the actual student per se. So when you go through and start learning about feedback in terms of behaviour management, and you start watching some of those videos, that will become more obvious if you're going down that road. I know some people only watch the videos as far as the teaching strategy side of it, but I mean, basically that goes like this. One option would be to say, John, you are behaving poorly. That's bad practice, as opposed to, John, your behaviour is poor, or whatever. So, or the behaviour you are demonstrating is poor. So that way you're kind of depersonalising it a little bit, and you're not putting that label on that student as being a person who is bad. What you're saying is the behaviour that you have chosen to use right now is that's a bad choice. That's bad behaviour, but that's not you as a personality or as a person. And that makes it easier for you to be able to slowly and gradually improve that student's behaviour. And I talk about that kind of stuff a lot in those behaviour ones. There's one behaviour strategy called gradual change, so that one might be worth watching as well. Okay. Yeah, so simple, clear, focused, immediate and specific. Make sure you remember those. And I'm going to have to rub all these off. I just want to go through one other little thing about how to actually write a comment. Best practice, I think it's best practice, for how to write a comment for a student how to write a comment for a student in a homework diary or in on an exam or on a project or on a piece of paper or anything like that. So bear in mind we also went through that 4-to-1 or 6-to-1 rule. Let's just call it 6-to-1 rule as far as providing lots of positive support. Positive is a bit of a buzzword these days. So you've got positive behaviour management, positive handling, positive... yes, there's lots of different... There's programs called PBS and SWPBS. I think PBS is the older one. This is the big one these days that is kind of a worldwide thing that's come out of the US, school-wide positive behaviour support. So positive classrooms is another one. But just remember that positive approach to managing students means you're trying to motivate them, develop their self-esteem so they'll come back and want to continue learning. And you do have to provide constructive criticism, but only sort of a limited amount. And bear in mind that there were those 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever it was, different ways or different approaches to providing feedback so that we help the student develop in their learning and their ability to learn over the medium to long term, because just completing a task today without having any type of deep understanding doesn't really help anyone that much. It looks fantastic and you say, yeah, the student is finished, but that's about as far as the benefit goes. So anyway, when we're writing a comment, let's say you've marked something or a short story, or even if you're a teacher aide and you've helped a student with a short story, you might want to put a comment on there. And remember, as we were saying, the point in this short story example, you want to put a lot of positive comments, a lot of ticks, maybe circle something if they're repetitively spelling a question wrong. You might just sort of underline that once or twice. But again, what type of benefit is that going to bring from the student? Are they going to see that and therefore be able to spell that word for the rest of their life? And is that even the purpose of that particular, the reason why you're providing feedback in that way? Probably not. So really just think through those things. I'm not saying you can't do that, but the point is strategically think through the way in which you go about providing feedback to students. So anyway, if you are writing a comment, there is a best practice methodology to it. Now, basically it goes like this. There are... And you don't have to follow this. You don't have to follow it. And I write comments sort of based on this, but it kind of flows anyway. So you sort of use it as a foundation to get you started. Now, the very first thing that I usually talk about is an overall comment. So that'll be, generally speaking, a good job, blah, 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 something along those lines. So it's an overall, not so much an overall summary, so it's a, yeah, I guess an overall summary. That might be a good way to, and we use this with adults as well because it's really effective. So an overall summary of what your general gist of the activity was or the work product was. Next year, you can mix number 2 and 3 up, but I usually go area to improve as the next thing. Now that area to improve, you could, and if you wanted to provide an extensive comment, you could do some dot points there, a couple of dot points. And again, just keeping it light. So I'd recommend that you consider doing this and this. A couple of spelling mistakes popped up, so make sure that you're editing and so forth, or your general understanding of the first topic was good. The second topic, I can see that you rushed it a little bit. So they're your areas to improve. Now, overall summary, area to improve. Area of I'm just going to go with done well. Normally when I think through this in my head, I was trying to be a bit too complicated, but normally when I think through this in my head, I usually think done well, done bad, but I didn't want to write that on the board, but there you go. So number 3 is an area where you've done well. Actually, I think probably, yeah, that one probably deserves to go where number 2 is. You've got an overall summary. Let students know what they've done well. Let's mix that up. I don't like that. You know, it doesn't really matter, I guess. And once you've done a few, you can go in your sort of own direction. Done well. I'm just going to go with the done bad. But I'll write dash improve. I'm sure there's probably a technical term for this type of thing, but anyway, and this whole process here, there are various different versions of this that you can find online and things. This is just the model that I follow. I don't know if this actually follows some type of famous model that has a name or anything. I think there are a couple of versions out there, and I might have picked this up from somewhere, but over time, mine has sort of developed in this way. Overall summary, what they did well, single sentence, but specifically, right? Because here you've done a bit of a summary, so that's more of a specific thing. And what I mean by specific is that you could either point out, you can actually point out some specific areas that they've done well. So I really liked how on the second sentence of the second paragraph, you linked that to the first paragraph. Or I really liked how you made your the handle on your vase or whatever. So you're being ultra specific. Remember how we're talking about providing feedback that was specific? So yeah, that is that one there. Things that you've done bad or that you want to improve. And again, that's just how I remember it. Done well, done bad. But I'm sure there's probably ways that we could articulate that slightly better. But when you're writing these, and if you're doing lots of them, then these little quick mnemonics so that you can remember them do come in handy. So, and the final one is sort of a broad, I'm going to call that the next time comment. Next time comment, and sort of like a motivation as well. Motivational comment. So that final one is where you can be a bit creative and you can push students in to the next assignment or the next project and give them some, either a bit of advice for next time. Actually, that's, next time advice. And you can also try and motivate them to then, the other thing that I always quite often put in here is a personal touch. So adding a bit of a personal touch towards the end, whether it's like, can't wait to see what you do next time, or I'm very proud of what you've achieved because I know you worked quite hard on this, or so on. So usually a little personal sentence there is really good to, again, try and motivate them in some way so that they can keep them engaged in that task and they feel that they have the means by which they can go on and do better next time, and also they have that confidence and self-esteem to want to keep trying. That's a big thing in education, particularly when you're working with kids. If you can develop that motivation, then you have more intrinsic motivation, so they want to be there, they want to be engaged, and they want to do those tasks. Then the speed you can get through content, the amount of knowledge that they retain, their conceptual understanding just goes through the roof, and your behaviour management issues just almost completely dissipate. So anyway, so an overall summary, one sentence. Overall, yeah, I think this was pretty good type of thing. Probably wouldn't say it like that, but you get the point. Something they did well, something specific, something that they did bad on, something where you could improve. Again, you could do one or two for each, but usually I just point one thing out, remembering that you don't need to point every single little thing out, and a broad next time motivational thing. So that's your recommendations for improvement. And actually, sometimes I usually put 5. So this is just a different way of doing it. Sometimes I normally do 5 when I'm teaching this. So number 4 is your recommendation. Recommendation for improvement. They're your metacognitive skills, transferable skills, probably not coping skills, but generally for next time I would recommend X, Y, Z. And then number 5, so that has to apply for if they were doing in the next topic. So if they did one assignment on dinosaurs and now they were going to go do an assignment on animals, what do you want them to do next time? That more broadly sort of speaking, what do you want them to do next time that's going to significantly improve that end product? And then there's that final one. So if this is like a broad overall feeling, number 5 again is a broad overall sort of that's your motivational or type final comment. So we'll write final motivation. Yeah, like just a final little nice touch just to end it, to water down these things a little bit just to make sure that they're not feeling too attacked, I guess, and that particularly if they've got a low score or 48% or 40% or even 65% or whatever. Some students can be a little bit down on that. So a little bit of final motivation that sort of says something like, even though you didn't get the best score this time, you've got the basics in place with a few changes. I think that the next one you will do really, really well. So again, a final little motivation or something that becomes a bit more broad and is more future looking is really important. So this one is historical, this one is historical, this one is historical, this one is future looking, and this one here is future looking as well. So that's future looking specific and future looking more broad. So I guess you could think of them in two different categories. Historical, let's go past, and let's go future. And that, by the way, is how you structure a basic paragraph, generally speaking, as well, right? So you'll start with, because you will usually write this in paragraph form, you'll start with something broad and you'll end with something broad. And that future-looking one is your link to the next paragraph. So anyway. Now, final thing I will say about this is that you do not need to follow that. There is no requirement to follow that. I kind of follow it, sort of 70%, I guess. Sometimes I do it exactly, but I don't stop and necessarily think about this as I'm writing stuff. Once you've done a few hundred comments or whatever, it'll just naturally come to you anyway. But generally, it's a good structure as a foundation to get you started. And if you do use that, and well, I guess what I mean is you can skip certain sections. So if you're happy with that and it's and you skip specifically what you've done well, then that's fine. If you skip, I really don't know if you'd skip the recommendations, but the final motivation you could probably skip, particularly if you've said something nice up here. So there's no reason why you can't mix it up as well. Okay, cool. So that is feedback techniques, and I highly recommend watching some of my other videos, such as those on questioning skills, formative assessment. They're probably the main ones as it relates to feedback techniques. And thank you for watching.